Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Festival of Trusteeship. It's our second day. This is session 4 of 14. You're all very, very, very welcome. I'm Penny. I'm the director of the Festival of Trusteeship at Eastside People. This session is called Risk It for a Biscuit. Are trustees playing it too safe? And there's already been some biscuit chat in the green room. Perhaps we'll have more of that from attendees. I don't know. So the session is being recorded, as you will have seen as you've come in. If you've booked this session singly, you'll get the recording probably today. If you're a weekly pass holder, we're sending you all recordings all together so that we don't inundate your inbox. You've been muted automatically on arrival. Please stay muted unless Nigel, who's chairing, comes to you for a question. But please note that if you unmute, you will be on the recording. So don't unmute if you don't want to be recorded. Closed captions are available. They've been enabled at our end. So if you'd like the subtitles, please click CC or closed captions on your device. Please feel absolutely free to use the chat to introduce yourselves, to share resources, to ask questions of the panel, to share experiences, to share thoughts. We'd really love to hear from you. Having said that, sometimes festival chats get very, very, very busy. And if that is a distraction for you, please just feel free to completely ignore it. If we take a question from the chat, we will repeat it. So you don't need to know what the question said in the first place. And when you receive the recording, the chat is on the recording. If there's a link or something that you want to follow up afterwards, you will find it with the recording. A reminder that if you don't already have a weekly pass, you can buy them right up until Friday, until our last day. They're £30 for access to all 15 sessions and all of the recordings. And a huge thank you to the Institute of Leadership. They're our headline sponsor this year, and it's thanks to their support that we've made the festival super accessible, which is just reflected in the huge numbers that we're attracting. Now, just a note on Scotland and Northern Ireland, we are mainly focusing on trustees in England and Wales. I don't think that this session is going to particularly be very legal in terms of the regulations in England and Wales, but actually just a reminder to please check local rules if we do start to talk about the law. And a final and huge thank you to all of these brilliant partners. Putting on a festival like this is a massive group exercise, and we're really grateful for all of these partners and their support. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass over to Nigel Kippax, who's chairing the session.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Delighted to welcome you to this session on risk. I'm joined by Sabrina, James, Ines, and Harriet, and I shall hand over to them in a moment. My name is Nigel Kippax. I'm a risk advisor at Charity Finance Group, and I guess this particular risk, it's an interesting topic. It's also rather a hot topic at the moment, and personally, I feel the whole area of risk and our attitude to risk and how we treat risk goes really to the heart of a charity and what the charity is all about, and how we actually how we create the impact of the charity. But we'll see what comes out in the discussion. I would just say that this is a discussion. This is not a teaching, as it were. You may disagree with one or two of the speakers. That's absolutely fine, and I fully expect one or two of the speakers to disagree with themselves, as it were. We have different experiences, different backgrounds, different roles, different kind of charities. So as the richness, hopefully it'll come from the discussion that all of us will at least gain something from, and that's what we're looking for. So thanks to Penny for the introduction, and going to fire away. And what I'm going to do is ask each panelist in turn a question. If they could just give a quick introduction about who they are and why they're here and so on, that'd be great. I'm going to turn to you first, James. In your area and your experience, the key risks that your board manage and why are they important?
Sure. Thanks, Nigel. So I'm James Fletcher. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the chair of trustees at the KFC Youth Foundation, the corporate foundation of of KFC, the fast food restaurant in the UK. I'm also a trustee of the John Lewis Partnership Foundation. Both are corporate foundations, and we have strong links to our to the brands that we're associated with, but we're independent charities. And I think that there's a common risk that we have between both corporate foundations is trying to strike that balance correctly by being responsive to the social impact required by our business colleagues, but also being independent and making sure that we are there for our beneficiaries to make sure that we fulfill our charitable objectives and that we are a financially solvent charity like every other.
Okay, thanks, James. Harriet, you need to unmute, Harriet.
Yep, I'm there. Okay, so yeah, I'm Harriet. I'm the Training and Development Manager of the Almshouse Association. The Almshouse Association was created in 1946 for its members, by its members. We support, guide and represent 1,600 independent almshouse charities across England and Wales. Almshouses, just in case you don't know what they are a charitable form of self-sufficient low-cost community housing that's held in trust for local people in housing need. They're managed and run by almshouse charities made up from local volunteer trustees. Today, there are around 37,000 people living in almshouses. Within these communities, there are friendships being made, residents live in safety and security. The Almshouse Association, we're there to represent these charities, help with fundraising, and work with them, the local authorities and the government to make it possible to build more almshouses. My role at the Almshouse Association, my key role is delivering trustee training, and in particular trustee training for new trustees, but also refresher trustee training. And then a very new focus we've had in the last year is delivering trustee recruitment training, so how to find your trustees. So that's a little bit about me.
So what particular risks do you face in that, Harriet?
So the Almshouse Association, I suppose, has, and I'm doing it from the association's perspective because each of the individual almshouse charities have got their own risks. But one of our biggest risks is that almshouses are not recognised as affordable housing by the government, and it's something that we're working on with the government to get that acknowledgement, because it has a major impact on planning funding. We also are, in ourselves, we're a very small charity supporting 1,600 members, and there are only 10.5 full-time equivalents in our association. Many of our member charities, and probably many of you as well, are unincorporated, which leaves the charities themselves at risk of personal liability. You know, we've talked about risk. What is risk? There are so many different types. And this is a serious concern for us, for them. Another risk we've got, I've already mentioned, is trustee succession planning. That's why we've got this focus on trustee recruitment, and the challenges that has for some of these really small charities that are out there. Trying to find trustees is really difficult, particularly if you're unincorporated. We also have, we've got 1,600 members, some who are really engaged, but we also, one of our risks is those members who are unengaged. So we don't know what they're exposing themselves to, or not exposing themselves to. We also have financially struggling members. It's a risk that we try and help with. And because our members are charities providing homes for independent living, one of the biggest things our members have a burden of is that residents who can no longer live independently, because people are living longer and longer. Dementia is becoming a greater issue, and we're worried about them in these homes, but also putting other people at risk and the property at risk.
Got it. Thanks.
And then
Thanks, Harriet.
the final risk, and the last one, it's a huge list, is the buildings. So that our trustees in these charities, as well as having people living there, they're going to look after the properties and all the risks that come with having an asset portfolio. Is huge for our member charities.
Yeah. Thanks, Harriet. Ines, what about yourself? If you could introduce yourself, where you're from, and what does the risk role mean for you in your role?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And hi, everyone. So I'm the head of risk, compliance, and culture at TRIAID, an international organization. And throughout my career, I have always been focused on professional ethics. That's my central point of focus, making sure that workplace culture where I work is both looking at integrity and impact and how they can actually reinforce each other. And so I began my career in highly regulated financial environments. And so 6 years ago, I made the move and came into the development sector. So my approach really focuses on creating conditions for a healthy culture, and one where people are actually empowered to bring their best in the service of creativity and the organization's mission. So at Triade, in terms of the key risk that the board is looking at, I would just mention three. The first one is definitely insecurity and staff safety, because as a charity operating in the drylands of Africa, and unfortunately in a region where in the past 10 years insecurity has grown and unrest has become more and more an issue, that's something that we are constantly monitoring. Obviously, looking at the definition of risk through the ISO 31000 and the CC26 definition, we are both looking at it from a threat angle, but also from an opportunity angle of what gives us, what can we exploit in that sense of it's an area where not many organizations can actually operate. The second one is looking at culture and people. Throughout the years and since the COVID pandemic, obviously organization and what has been really important for us has been to focus on the culture and how things are changing so rapidly in the society and how that's impacting our team. And the third one is definitely looking at undetected fraud and how can we prevent any fraud instance, and how can we actually use that as something to motivate the teams to make sure that financially we have the right control and processes in place.
Thanks, Ines. Sabrina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nigel, and thank you all for coming. I'm noticing that we just made it over the 200 participant mark. So Penny, you owe us all risk biscuits after this. So thank you all for coming today. And I'm so glad that you're all here to be interested in learning a little bit more about risk in the charity sector. My name is Sabrina Segal. I'm the director of the Risk Collaborative. We are a collaborative project in association with the Charity Finance Group in the UK. And the focus of the Risk Collaborative is to really start to frame conversations around risk management in the charity space, so in the third sector. We focus on education and advocacy with funders, charity leaders, and charity trustees to think about risk a little bit differently. And I think this is what Nigel's going to be going at today. And I'm really happy that Ines was mentioning, and I put it in the chat as well, the ISO 31000 definition of risk is the definition of risk that I'm hoping we can all start moving towards. And it's very simple, it's 6 words. It's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. I am a trustee at Triade, but Ines already kind of talked a lot about what we're doing at Triade, but I'm going to talk about my experience supporting trustees and working specifically on risk with trustees. And there's some really interesting statistics. NCVO did a study in 2023, and in the UK, they found that 67% of small and medium-sized charities, so that's annual budgets under £5 million, reported having no formal risk management framework. These risk management frameworks do not need to be complicated. In fact, the more simple they are, the better it is for everybody. But if there really is nothing there for you to sort of hang your risk hat on, that's when we start to get into trouble. So the approaches and the common areas of risk that I've seen when working with trustees is, number one, they don't really have a way of looking at both threats and opportunities, evaluating them, having good discussions about them, and then being able to come to an informed decision. But one of the other things that I see a lot when I'm working with trustees is a fear of speaking up, which is really surprising to me because you are all grown adults and you are trustees of a charity. And it's not just cultural. I know, people who are British will say, well, we have to be polite, but it's not just the Brits. There's a lot of other trustees that I've worked with. And there seems to be this effect that when you go into the boardroom, sometimes the common sense hat comes off, or sometimes the ability to kind of question things that don't quite line up seems to disappear as you walk through that door. And so what I would say the biggest risk for trustees is not establishing that speak up, speak out culture among yourselves as a board initially, so that you can very politely but clearly question if things aren't making sense. Because if we end up falling into groupthink and we just get along to get along, that's when a lot of the major problems start happening. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this session, sharing a little bit more about some methodologies and tools that we can use to make it easier. And Nigel, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sabrina. Some interesting points there, particularly around your area of the fear of speaking up. So the risk for a personal risk in speaking up, and why, and different people, different surroundings, and different situations. James, building on that, Sabrina started to touch on how risk was formally managed, and mentioned that the majority of smaller charities don't have a formal way. How would you address that? What's the formal way that you would take on that maybe touches on these areas of trustee engagement or senior management engagement and empowerment and culture and speaking up?
Sure. So thinking about the CC26, and it makes the point that trustees own risk, but they don't have to necessarily be the undertaker of mitigations of risk, right? I know we have lots of colleagues on the call today from smaller organisations, so that might not necessarily be true. But for organisations that have lucky enough to have a few volunteers or members of staff, it's about everyone coming together to spot risks in the day-to-day running of a charity, to think them through, to properly monitor them, and to report that sort of formally. Just thinking about how one of my trusteeships at the John Lewis Partnership Foundation, we have a very simple risk register with essentially the risk, the mitigation, the owner, and a heat map, which we might go on to a bit later. I think in terms of how we make it easy to scan these lists to make sure what our biggest risks are. But I was a couple of months ago, I was a trustee of a different charity called the Golden Jubilee Trust, and we just merged with the John Lewis Partnership Foundation. And not to give away sort of trustee confidential papers, but the merger itself was a risk that we pointed out, and I think it's really important that we don't just think every year, oh, we kind of need some money, so we need to make sure that we have finances there. We need to make people safe because we're an employer. Actually, risks can come and go, and the risk to us as a charity of merging was real, and we spelled that out in detail. But that risk will disappear. And when we fully merge, and when that sort of piece of work is over, then it's time for that to disappear from the risk register. And I think it's I love Sabrina's point about it being simple, but also needs to be live too. And it's a document that all trustees need to own, because it's something that we should be referring to time and time again.
So that you mentioned your risk register and a fairly simple risk register. In your opinion, does it work, and would you like to change it in some way?
I think it works, because even down to the basic conversation of if you have likelihood times impact equals likelihood times impact equals the severity of the risk, and then color code that in some way, red being scariest risk, green being least scary risk. I think it focuses trustee minds. Trustees are sometimes required to think about broad brush things quite quickly, and being able to just argue the point about whether that is in fact a 2 or a 3 sometimes means that you talk about the whole thing in itself. So you don't have to be an expert at financial risk management. You don't have to be an expert at safeguarding risk management in order to ask the question of whether that is really coded correctly. And then if you use a heat map, so red being the scariest, green being the least scary, then you can keep coming back to that, and you can keep making sure as an organization that you're comfortable where you are. The goal is not necessarily to make everything green, because that's not necessarily possible, but it's to make sure you keep coming back to those reds and oranges and greens in time to make sure that they're coded correctly. I think it works for me, but I'm pretty much a simple thinker. I'm sure there are more complicated ways to do it, but it works for me in the context of being a trustee, at least.
Okay.
I think James has made a really good point that a lot of people do a risk register, file it away, and forget about it. And the key thing with a risk register is it's constantly reviewed on an ongoing basis. And that way, trustees can demonstrate that they've acted reasonably. Even if it still stays amber or red, if they've reviewed it and it's dated, they can show what they're up to. They've got that useful data, that document, the reports, the conversations there. Going back to the title of this, will you risk it for a biscuit? And what is your biscuit plain and boring, or is it definitely not an Oreo? Something gooey and squidgy and yummy. I agree with James. It's got to be under constant review.
Yeah,
and
just sorry, Nigel. I just picked up. There's a bit of the chat about it being some of the most boring part of the agenda, but actually, maybe going through spreadsheets isn't everyone's favorite thing to do. But actually, making that live and understanding what we're really talking about when we are thinking about this risk register is the way to bring it to life for trustees. And I think that playing the role of chair in that means that it's your job to actually make sure people are engaged. Sometimes things are boring, but we are all governors of charities and we need to take it seriously.
Interesting point. So who takes the lead in your charities, James, on this risk discussion?
In terms of the discussion, it's usually the team will deliver the papers, but the trustees own it. As I said earlier, it's the trustees' duty to own all of the risk. And there was another point in the chat about who owns the risk. Trustees own all the risk, but they don't necessarily always undertake the action to mitigate the risk. But it's just trustees' responsibility to make sure someone is.
Yeah. So collective decision making on the board. Ines,
hopefully.
Hopefully. Ines, what about your experience? How it's managed, and what are some of the upsides of it works, and what are some of the maybe areas that you think moving forward we'd like to change?
Yes, thank you for the question. And just before going into the upside and what needs to be changed, I think that I'd like to follow up on James's point and Harriet's point around the risk register. And I know some will advocate to throw them out completely. Some will hold them close to their hearts. So I guess what I always come back to, especially when working with smaller organization, low resources, but to some extent, even in a bigger organization where actually you need to think about being efficient, is what is the intention? Because when I started at Triade, it was the first time we equipped the organization with a risk function. That was 6 years ago. And so initially we had this very long list to which I could have added 100 entries. Risk here, risk there. Okay, so that gives us a very long list. Some are green. And from that point of view, you're thinking, okay, is this just a sheet of paper where I'm listing everything that I can think of that could negatively affect the organization? Or is there a better way? What am I trying to achieve here? And so progressively, we kind of shifted the approach. And it's something that, takes time for the board, for the team to get adjusted to. But looking at, again, very simply, the definition that we mentioned so far, the CC26 also definition, but also ISO definition of the effects of uncertainty on objectives. Looking at the organization's objectives and starting from there, because that's what's critical right now for your organization, and looking at what could disrupt our course of action, what we are trying to achieve, going from there and focusing on these risks. We can add colors, we can add whatever is making it practical, going back to the intention of what are we doing this for, making it visually in a way that fits the board, that's great. But we should be only considering what is the most essential risks, what can really disrupt the organization, and looking at both sides of, if it's a disruptor, let's consider the negatives, but also the positives. And it's not easy because we're not necessarily trained to do that. The mind has a tendency, a bias towards the negative. That's what we are going to focus on. But looking at really linking our objectives with these specific events should be the core. And then what are we trying to do? What does it mean to manage the risk? And then going into what James described in terms of active monitoring and looking at trigger points, looking at what are we doing. But again, the risk register can be, that's how we have been using it. It can be an opportunity for discussion. More than actually, we've kind of gone away from debating the different scores because this can be very personal and subjective, and we don't necessarily have in our sector the data to back up these impacts and likelihood scores. So looking at more of a discussion point and using very simple prompts such as what keeps you up at night, and staff safety when you operate in a high volatility context is one that will usually come up for people. But going back to that, what keeps you up at night? What are your objectives? And then looking at what's your intention. So discussion, making sure that there's transparency, there's an understanding of how decisions are being made, holding the exec team to account from one quarter to another. Looking at continuity. So if someone leaves, someone crucial leaves, we still have an account of the mitigation measures that we have in place to overcome the risk or to manage or to exploit the opportunity, and keeping a record of the changing risk landscape. What was our perception of the situation, pre-COVID, and what was our situation post-COVID? That's really, it's an easy example because the difference was so stark. So yes, I think that the matter, to answer your question around the upside and what has changed, it's been making it simpler, removing the scores, because actually we were not focusing on the 100 something list. We are focusing now at Trade more on 11 risks. Some are strategic, some are more business as usual, and they're all red. Okay, there's one that's, there's a stronger one, and we still have a little bit of color because different minds like different visuals. We still have some scores, but now they're very indicative. They're more like just to rank them and for us to say, okay, this one weights a little bit more importantly on our list. But I would say it's a basis and just a tool, but it's not the cornerstone of how we manage risk.
I like your point there that Ines, where you may have your register, you may have the spreadsheet, you may have the colours, and you're using that to facilitate a dialogue, and you're not using it as you're not using it to codify a decision. You're looking at facilitating a dialogue, and then there's a judgment decision that follows, which helping you along the way with that. The other thing I picked up is that when you were looking at risk, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but rather than look from an in-out perspective, you're looking from an out-in perspective. Why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? What's stopping us? What's helping us? And coming back into the organization. And that way you've come up with 11 risks, not 111. I think that's interesting. Sabrina, do you want to build on that?
I'll say something very controversial that people who have heard me speak before will hear me say is I actually don't see any value in heat maps, registers, or appetite statements. And I'll tell you why. I think that they do kind of help facilitate conversation, but they give a false sense of security. And I think that trustees, when they look at this and they talk about it once a quarter and they high five each other and pat themselves on the back and they move a number here or there and it goes back on the shelf, is that really managing risk or identifying opportunity? Or is it just talking about something that is static and backwards looking? The traditional sort of risk management one era tools, so the tools that we've all been talking about, are very static. They do not link to organizational objectives, and most of all, they don't link to resourcing. And when you are trying to manage risk in a low to no resource environment, which is where we are in this sector, we need things that are going to be extremely efficient and easy to use. There are a lot of other tools and methodologies out there that you can use. The other thing too is the impact and likelihood kind of axes are really subjective. And so what has ended up happening over time, because these tools were introduced in like the 1950s, what's happened over time is the rigorous quantitative analysis that used to be put behind that when manufacturing companies or aerospace companies or chemical petro companies were using that, they had data and they were running analysis, quantitative analysis, to give them ranges on likelihood and impact. What has happened over time is that that's become quite subjective. And it's very difficult for us in the charity sector to have clean and verifiable data in order to have accurate ranges for likelihood and impact. So what ends up happening is it's just people's gut feeling about likelihood and impact around something. So what we're doing is we're taking a quasi-quantitative analysis with qualitative information, putting it into a register or a heat map, and then using that maybe to make decisions from. And so it's this disconnect where we're finding, actually, even in the private sector right now, that a lot of organizations are moving away from what they're calling risk management 1, and they're moving more towards either cross-functional team qualitative analysis, which is what I recommend for charities because we don't have that quantitative approach, or private sector companies who have that quantitative data are moving much more to heavy quant tools, Monte Carlo simulations, R regressions, things like that. Good news, anything that I just said about the quantitative stuff, if you don't understand it, you don't need to, because we are not in a position within our sector to be able to use those tools. So what we really, I advise trustees that I work with and organizations that I work with, and Ines knows because I've been chatting with her about this myself, is saying we need to use something that is much more objective centric and utilizes the wisdom of the cross-functional expertise that we have either through volunteers or staff or on the board to help give us a multifaceted view of both the threats and the opportunities. But we need to start with the objectives of the organization. And exactly what Nigel was just talking about, kind of that inside out, outside in. When we start the analysis with what the organization is trying to achieve, it helps us kind of buffer out a lot of the noise that we hear going on. I mean, I read the Charity Commission's risk report that came out. It was lovely. I was thrilled that they were starting to put their toe in that water, but you could have gotten the same risks essentially out of anything that McKinsey or any of the EY or any of the other ones put out, the global risk reports that come out every year. It was very similar stuff. What we really need as trustees and as risk managers of charities is to understand the impacts of what we're trying to achieve, and then the first, second, and third order of effects. So very easy questions to ask is you start with your objective and then you say, what are the threats and what are the opportunities? What's going to prevent us from achieving this objective, but also what is going to enhance our achievement of the objective? We need to give as much attention to the opportunities that are coming our way as the threats. We then, once we outline those, we then ask ourselves, what are the causes of these threats, right? What are the triggers that will happen that we can start to monitor for that will help us get out in front of the threats before it prevents us from achieving our objective? Same thing on the opportunity side. What are the indicators? What are the green shoots? What am I picking up in my operating environment that an opportunity is coming my way and I want to make sure I am positioned well enough to take advantage of it? The last question we ask ourselves then is, what are our preparation elements? What are the things that we need to do to be prepared for the causes that will trigger our threats, but also be prepared for the indicators that will show us those opportunities? Those preparation elements that you then map out need to be priced. Staff time, hardware, software, materials, whatever it is you need, because that then ties very directly your risk analysis into your budgeting and resourcing, which traditional risk tools don't do. Once you have that map, and it takes about 45 minutes with a cross-functional team, you guys can knock this out. Doesn't require a lot of heavy thinking. You then have real data and evidence that either your trustees, your senior leadership, or maybe even funders that you're going out with a funding proposal to, you can start to have a real conversation about what is necessary to achieve the objectives of your organization. This integrates risk thinking into the work of your organization. It is built in and not bolted on at the end. And it also gives trustees forward-looking data instead of backward-looking data to make these decisions. It's dynamic, it's integrated, it's strategic, it's really effective. So there's my pitch. Burn your risk register, burn your risk matrix. Don't bother with the appetite statement. There are better tools out there that we can use in the charity space.
Sabrina, thanks ever so much. I like your bit of history on that, and the history of from the commercial, from the corporate sector, petrochemical sector, my old sector, and yeah, that's really interesting. I think the other thing that screams out from what you're saying is that there is no change, there is no growth without risk. So any change brings with it inherent risk in that decision, which kind of leads on to the next kind of train of thought, which was going to go on. And we touched on the importance of culture, the importance of behaviour, collective decision making. All this is mindset and very much a people issue. So what is it that stops boards sitting down and actually making those progressive decisions? What stops a board collectively deciding to do something, kind of push the boundaries, i.e. what might actually be holding the board back and being risk averse? James, do you want to try and put some
Yeah.
Firstly,
I want to just thank Sabrina on that. As she was speaking, I was just thinking, wow, yeah, we could do a little bit of that, because I think the word risk is always, to me, just obviously just means bad things, right? But actually, if there is a risk of not doing good things, and there's a serious risk of that. And I think that organisations that like all of ours that exists to make the world a better place, in summary, we constantly don't make the decision that makes the world a better place, sometimes because we don't have enough money, or we think we don't have enough money. We think the due diligence of partnership or collaboration will just be too painful. Sometimes might be a little bit of arrogance as well, that we can do it better. Or we think we can do it better, don't ask anyone else. And I think that, given that, the trustees often just meet every so often. In some organisations, and I'm sure they're represented here, a bit more operational, or meet more frequently, or do the sort of operational work of a charity. But I think that if in charities like the mine that I'm a trustee of, we have a couple of members of staff who are there every day, seeing the real impact that we can have, and they often find themselves coming to us to pitch an idea, and then they have to sort of do a lot of work to bring us along with them, because we just think, oh, that sounds like a lot of work for you. That sounds like we're going to spend a lot of money. Oh my God, we haven't got any connections in that particular area of the country. The KFC Foundation, which I'm chair, we were a grant-making foundation, and now we actually deliver our own services. We've just opened a youth club in Middlesbrough, and that was a big deal for us, because all of a sudden we were an employer. We were spending money on spaces, on actual physical things. We had to stop giving as many grants as we did in order to open this, and for temporarily think that we might not have the impact that we did before, because we actually have now focused solely on this one area. So I think this is a question of change as well, right? And often people don't like change, but there's something in trustees trusting their teams and trusting their instincts, and actually being a bit more entrepreneurial in their thought about how you sort of get out there and try to make a difference. Because if you're not quite satisfied with what you're doing now, then maybe there is a different story. And actually, the thing that got us over the line as the KFC Youth Foundation board is that we wanted to actually tell our own story with the impact that our donors are having. We used to tell our story via others. We can still do that, but we can tell our own story now, and that was really important to the demographic of donors that the foundation has. It's worked wonders. But it took a year or so to get there, and we were worried, but it's paid off, and I'm glad the team took us there.
James, I've got to pick up on that. That's a really good story. So you're an example of a board that took quite a brave decision, and demonstrating very well that any decision like this has consequences, and upside and downside. Now there's a trade-off. And there's a trade-off of fewer grants, but the other side of it was you've opened a youth club in Middlesbrough. You're doing something different, and I love because that was going to ask the question. What is it that came to the party that enabled that group of trustees to make such a decision? And you answered it, which is, and I love this, is what's our story? What's the story we're going to tell? And so much of being a trustee is is, what are you doing with those assets? Are you just looking after them and hiding them away and giving them back after 3 years, or are you looking to grow them? Are you growing your your talents? And that what's the story we're going to tell after our tenure? That's a really powerful, really powerful image.
And to finish that point, I don't need to tell fundraising colleagues across the sector, but it's not just about the story you tell yourselves as trustees to say we've done a good job, well done, everyone. It's actually we can do a better job, we can do a better job, we continue to do a good job. Funders come with us on that journey, and so it enables us to do that as well. So it's. I don't think we fully understand all the positive and maybe some negative impacts of our decision yet, but we're monitoring it. But I think, in summary, we took a risk. We were risk averse, but we did it anyway, and now it's paying off.
That's really great, Harriet. You mentioned in your intro your focus on culture and more behaviours and trustees and bringing new trustees and so on. How what is it in your work, or what is it you will be doing in the future to bring people into the board, or to get that board to behave and make decisions that are not risk averse?
That's an interesting question, because the Almshouse Association, we obviously take thousands of calls every year from our members, and we hear lots of different stories about stuff that's going on. And I think James has demonstrated your Tunnocks tea cake. It's lovely and gooey and chocolatey, but a lot of our members are a bit of a boring rich tea biscuit. We've got members we do have members who are Tunnocks tea cakes, but a lot of our members, for example, they build up substantial funds, they sit on these funds, they park the money rather than utilise those funds, and they take that cautious approach because they've always done it like this, and they're scared of change. And they don't really want to step their big toe outside into the slightly, I don't know, lukewarm water or maybe boiling water. And whereas they could use this money, it would be amazing. They could build more almshouses that more people in need can benefit from. Other stories that we hear every day are the charities that are cautious over who can live in their almshouses. I mean, they're worried about the risk of having a person who comes and lives in their almshouse who cannot live independently. But we've got so many wonderful stories about where residents live in almshouses with care packages, and they live there for years and years and years. In fact, we've got data that shows that if you live in an almshouse, you will live longer. We need our charities and the trustees of those charities to be more like James's charities and be a little bit more brave.
So can I ask you then, Harriet, if you in your current role, if you were saying looking to next year, 2026,
yeah,
what might you be doing differently when your recruitment and your training of trustees to get them to be more entrepreneurial, more forward-looking in their decision?
So what our big drive from our trustee recruitment workshop is getting trustees to recruit the right trustees, because the Charity Commission data shows not just small charities, but all charities do this tap on the shoulder thing. So you end up with, to coin a phrase, the old boys network running a charity. So your mate's mate and your mate's mate's mate, and they're all running a charity. They don't necessarily have the right pool of skills to run that charity, and actively recruiting and pulling people in you don't know to be trustees of your charity. Yes, it feels risky, but in the long term, you are going to run your charity better.
All right, yeah, good point. Of course, that leads to the whole discussion around, we won't cover it here, but the whole discussion around
Nigel, can I just highlight something?
Diversity in decision making and that and so on. Before you jump in, Sabrina, Penny, just very quickly, was there anything in the chat or whatever that was screaming out to be addressed? There might not be. We may be covering it already, but just is there anything that's screaming out?
I think there's been absolutely loads of amazing comments and helpful things for other attendees, and there have been some questions which I've been tracking. I think all but one have been addressed as we've been talking. If attendees think I'm wrong, repost your question, please. And I think the one which perhaps hasn't been addressed is Karina's, which is what about when the risks are to do with your trustees themselves? So she says lack of responsiveness, holding up decisions, lack of governance knowledge. How do we address that?
I wonder if, Ines, did you have any experience of this? When the trustees themselves are the problem?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to Harriet's point around how to recruit them and looking for the right fit for the organization. You're looking for certain skills, but certain skills have also to be safe to be kind of used in a way. So I think we mentioned quite a few, but I would add looking for trustees who are curious and making sure that actually if someone is disengaging, looking at the process to actually having a discussion with the board to make sure that actually what's the issue here, understanding what's the root, at the root of the problem before making an assumption, because we've talked, I think Sabrina mentioned the importance of speaking up and speaking out even at the trustee level. And that might be an issue because someone might see a situation or someone as being the blocker, but they actually might not be comfortable with how decisions are being made. So it's around understanding the dynamics. And if it's really someone who's no longer engaged, it's about having that open and constructive discussion about maybe them needing to move on with the next chapter, because of what's important here is making sure that the charity is moving forward in the right direction and serving its organization. But in terms of to go back to Harriet's point around what you look for, I think that making sure that trustees are staying curious, looking at behaviors, looking at what is driving behaviors is really important. And it's something that it's harder to do because it's going beyond the papers that are being sent to the board, but looking at, okay, how is the organization being managed? What are the behaviors that are being modeled and setting the examples? And I think that these are very important questions that even at the trustee level, they should look at each other and have this discussion. When we talk about board effectiveness, going beyond just questions, but also having discussions of why, again, what's the intention in these meetings, what each person is bringing to the table, and making sure that basically the organization's objectives and serving the beneficiaries is at the heart of everyone's actions.
And I guess to build on that, one of the key risks, of course, are the people, and not just the people leaving, the people staying. And within a board, having those terms of office, having those ways of what is your way to exit somebody, what is your protocol for voting somebody off the board, and yes, and the time to agree that is before you've got a problem. Harriet, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'm sort of agreeing with Ines in that sometimes when you're looking for trustee, it's not just about the skill. I don't know, it might not necessarily about finding someone who's financial or finding someone who knows how to look after buildings or finding someone who, I don't know, got a tangible skill written on a certificate. What Ines was saying is you might be looking for someone who is a good decision maker, has been a chair on a board before. They haven't necessarily got an architectural degree, but they've got experience being a chair or going and talking to people, because soft skills are as important as or intangible skills are as important.
Particularly with a part-time a team of part-time volunteers.
Definitely.
James, you wanted to add something?
In order to sort of keep up with the pace of change that the executive part of the KFC Foundation is going through, the trustees are having to go through a little bit of a change process ourselves at the moment, and we were very used to being quite involved in the not day-to-day running, but much more involved in the sort of minutiae of the charity a couple of years ago than we are now, and that's taken a few of us, me included, a little bit of time to get used to. And we're lucky enough to be able to have a facilitator who's coming in January to help us conclude that and set up some rules of engagement. But I suppose that there's something to be said about you might have a skills need in a trustee board at one moment. Those will evolve over time, and that's okay. That's to be encouraged, and that sometimes means that people do need to leave after a while or need to change their approach. And all this is positive. These are all good things for the charity, and it's a sign of the charity is moving forward.
Sabrina.
Thank you, Nigel. I think that two things. One, I think what James and Harriet and Ines were all just saying about board skill sets. I think that we need to be a little bit more creative about what a board will look like, actually. And I think we need to evolve that thinking. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who's involved in advising on a decision is a trustee. There's a wonderful wealth of information, knowledge out there from advisors, having a shadow advisory board or having non-voting members on subcommittees where technical expertise is really needed on something maybe that your organization is doing is extremely helpful, because that way you can bring in that thinking around whatever it is you need, like James was saying. And then, when that project or when that change moment has passed, those people can be thanked for their service and they'll go their way and you'll go yours. And I think we really need to, it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's registered as a trustee with the Charity Commission who can help boards make decisions. That was the first thing. The other thing I wanted to kind of go back to, when Harriet was giving her example about the almshouse and the benefits that come out from people who live there, they live longer. And, there's concerns about people who may not be self-sufficient, but here's how we do. What she just described was exactly what I was talking about. What she described was not only are there threats from the people living in the almshouses, but there's incredible opportunities. And organizations that think like that can develop better partnerships. She might be able to develop other partnerships with other charities that are in the space that can help with people who maybe aren't fully independent, or other charities in the space that are dealing with mental health and wellness or things like that. And I'm sure they already are doing this, but these are wonderful ways for organizations to find opportunities to build their network, grow their partnerships, and find other opportunities, both for funding, but also for impact in their community. So risk management is really, it just kills me when I only see the threat part of it. Looking at that opportunity part, the same way that Harriet was just talking about, gets so much more value when you're thinking about risk for organizations.
Great, thanks for that. We're coming to a moment of kind of pulling this together and closing it off. Just a couple of things that spring to my mind from what you've been saying. First of all, this is all about people. This is about people. This is about decision making. And it's about who's making those decisions, who's got permission to speak up, and the whole area of that team dynamic is critical. You make the point you made there, Sabrina. Yes, would agree that wholeheartedly. Every charity I've been involved with in the past has struggled to get trustees, and yet every time, and I've done it 4 or 5 times over the last few years, every time I've gone out to somebody and said, "Would you be prepared to sit on an advisory board without all the business of being a trustee and the legality, being advisory board and still contribute to those discussions?" All the time I've done that, nobody's ever said no. Nobody's ever said no. So yes, being prepared to say, we have 10 people on our board. Why have we got 10 people? Why haven't we got 4 or 5 and 4 or 5 advisors who come in at the important time? You don't need to have 10, 12, 15 people on a board. So that's absolutely a key point. I think the other point that it is about people. We're talking about recruitment questions. Interesting piece of research, which is getting published hopefully this week. It's going out, which was completed at Bath University last year, because I commissioned it, and it was around looking basically at the difference between a fully paid salaried board and a board of part-time volunteers. How do they differ? And in terms of alignment to the mission, alignment to how the boards make decisions. And one of the key findings of that research is the importance of intrinsic motivation over extrinsic motivation. So if you are extrinsically motivated, you are less likely to be aligned with the mission of the charity. intrinsically motivated, you're going to have more energy and more. And actually, when it comes to recruitment, yes, get the knowledge, get the skills, but are we actually looking at how people are motivated? Why? Asking the why question. Why do you want to be on the board? What is it that you really want to do? And of course, linked with that is personal legacy. And every for a trustee to attend 4 board meetings over 3 years, that means you are engaged with that charity for 24 hours. You have 24 hours to make an impact. That is it. So what's the impact you're going to make over the 24 hours? And if you're not prepared to take the risks and speak up and contribute and put yourself at risk, then there's very little chance of actually things changing. If things don't change, you're not going to increase the impact, you're not going to grow the legacy. And going back to the role of the trustee, you are not actually going to be making best use of the assets that you have been entrusted with. So there's a risk for you personally that after your 3-year tenure, you just give back what you had 3 years before. And individuals, we should see that as a risk. So there we are. That's that bit. What I will finish on. I asked the 4 panel members if there's just one key message that you wanted to give out to the audience, which is how much? We've lost a couple. We're down to 199. If there's one key message you wanted to give out, Sabrina, what would that one key message be?
I think you already heard me say it. Abandon risk management 1, move to risk management 2. Move to things that are going to provide value, insight, forward-looking, linking to objectives, linking to resources. These are the conversations that are going to spark the decisions that are going to be informed with your trustees. And the dusty old risk matrices and heat maps, leave them behind. Give them a big hug, thank them for their service, leave them behind.
Yeah, Harriet, what's the one thing you would say? Well, your one key message.
I think I would link into Sabrina a little bit and say, on a charity commission, there is something called CC3A, and in there it outlines the 6 main duties of a trustee. And one of those 6 main duties, and you can go away, everybody, and you can read CC3A yourself, but one of those 6 is to act with reasonable care and skill. Now, you could see that as a threat to a charity, but also you can grab this and make it an opportunity.
Harriet, I'm going to have to cut you off because I've got to give it back to Penny in about 60 seconds.
Right, that's fine.
Ines, one key message.
One key message is leveraging on these 24 hours. I think you just mentioned being curious, having courage, and just asking questions until you understand what's happening, and don't assume that everyone else knows. You might be
James, what's your 1 point?
I suppose it's the sort of jump at a well-managed risk, because you never know what impact you might have.
Yeah. Penny, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nigel, James, Sabrina, Ines and Harriet. Who knew risk could be so interesting? And we've had a wildly busy chat full of really fascinating questions and expertise as well. So thank you. A few other sessions that attendees might be interested in. At 4:30, we've got How to Close Well, a session on charity closure and merger. Tomorrow at 12:30, I thought this might come up and it did. We've got Challenge Accepted, How to Disagree Well. Back to Sabrina's point about we actually not disagreeing is a really big risk. On Friday, we've got Strategy Tips for Trustees at 12:30. And at 4:30 on Friday, we've got a closing session, which is How Not to Be a Prat on a Board, among many other sessions this week. So I'm sure that we'll see lots of attendees at those. Thank you again to the Institute of Leadership, who are our headline sponsor. And to Stone King, Fair Collective, and lots of other organisations and partners that have helped us. And please do check out Eastside People. We offer lots of support to boards around good governance, and we're a trustee recruiter as well. So please check out eastsidepeople.org. And thank you very much all for coming. Thank you.